Okay, everybody, we might start the evening. My name's Professor Grant MacArthur. I'm the Executive Director of the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre. A very warm welcome to you here whilst we talk about cancer clinical trials, the day after the International Clinical Trials Day. So in beginning tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I very much like to acknowledge any colleagues and that work on Indigenous health and any Indigenous people in the room today. A very important part of improving outcomes for cancer and other conditions in our community. So we're here to talk about clinical trials. Needless to say, we're here tonight because clinical trials are absolute cornerstone of our cancer research program, where we turn new ideas into proving better outcomes for patients with cancer. So we're here to learn about that. We're going to hear from some experts in clinical trials. I'd like to very warmly welcome James Craig and also Julie Zerner, who are two patients that will share their experiences. And before we kick off, I'd just like to do a little audience interaction. So as a part of the International Clinical Trials Day, I did a radio interview on 774 ABC Melbourne last Thursday, and the host of the morning program, Jacinta Parsons, and I learnt that we share something in common. We both have been participants in clinical trials. In fact, Jacinta had been on 2 clinical trials, she said. And so I just, by way of interaction with you all, could you put your hand up if you have participated in a clinical trial as a research participant? So I think there's about 7 or 8 of us, and really notably 2 doctors, both talking tonight, both put their hands up. So that's very interesting. So I'll introduce in a moment our first speaker, who did put her hand up as well as myself. So let's kick off with the program now, and you'll hear from 4 speakers, and then we'll have plenty of opportunity for interaction with a Q&A up the front that I will chair. Please think about your questions. We want this to be very, very interactive. And so we all can learn about clinical trials, because we constantly learn about clinical trials from patients and their supporters and families as to what the best way of doing clinical trials is. So our first speaker tonight is Dr. Hung Quach from St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. So Hung is the Director of Haematology Clinical Trials at St Vincent's, and she's a consultant laboratory and clinical haematologist. A star in clinical trials here in Melbourne, and Hung gives her apologies because she has to unfortunately leave soon after her presentation, but she's one of our clinical trial stars, and Hung, we look forward to your wisdom tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Grant, and thank you to all the organisers for this very kind invitation to make an introductory talk on clinical trials, a topic really close to my heart, because as a clinician, clinical trials is currently not only the cornerstone but an integral component in everyday medicine, in particularly cancer care. So much so that clinical trials is now incorporated into part of the recommended algorithm of treatment in cancer. So, in fact, if you look at, for example, our national guideline on the treatment of multiple myeloma, which is one of the blood cancers very common in Australia, or any other international guideline in cancer care in general, oftentimes you will see that one of the first path in the algorithm, in the recommended algorithm, is for patient to be enrolled in a clinical trial if an appropriate one is available. And in fact, in our national multiple myeloma guideline, it's only if there is no appropriate clinical trials is the patient recommended to be treated as part of standard of care. And because of that, I think it's really important for patients and family members and members of the community to understand exactly what clinical trials are all about, to avoid any misconception that may impact on the choice of optimal management for the particular individual. So what is a clinical trial? So clinical trials are basically any research that are done on humans to assess the impact on health outcome from a particular intervention. And that intervention can be anything from a treatment, such as drugs or a surgical intervention or a new process of care or behavioural treatment. Or it could range from a technique or a strategy to prevent a particular disease, or indeed just a biochemical test to prevent or screen or early detection in cancers, or intervention to improve quality of life. And the health outcome can range from anything from safety to that intervention, effectiveness, quality of life, and so on. But the ultimate aim of a clinical trial is, number one, to improve the outcome for patients, and in a broader sense, to improve clinical practice, and on an even broader sense, to lift up the standard of care of medicine in general for the community. So that's some of the reason why clinical trials are important, but the crux of it all is that, as Grant just mentioned, clinical trials is the only portal by which the amazing discoveries in the lab that is done by all our unsung heroes, and they're the scientists, can be translated into actual benefit in the clinic, which is where it ultimately matters. And for me as a clinician, not only are there scientific value to this, but at a practical level, sometimes clinical trials is the only way for me to offer an option or hope for patients in whom there are none otherwise. And at an even more practical level, sometimes clinical trials is the only way for me to access proven drugs, effective drugs, but which are not available in Australia because they are not reimbursed on the PBS, and that's just at a practical level. And so on that note, I just want to briefly explain the place of clinical trials in context within our health system, so you have a bit of a framework and you understand what I'm on about when I talk about the TGA and the PBS, etc. So in Australia, as you know, we're very lucky to have a national healthcare system that ensures equitable access to healthcare and drugs for everyone, regardless of our private health fund status. And so the two important components of our healthcare system is the Medicare and the PBS. And Medicare is a publicly funded program that ensures equitable access to health services at little or no cost, and the PBS provides subsidised prescription drugs to all Australians. So when a drug is said to be PBS reimbursed, it means that it's largely paid for and we can actually access it at little or no cost. But before a drug can be considered for reimbursement on the PBS, it must first be approved and registered by our national regulatory agency, that's the TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration. And the role of the TGA is to make sure that all therapeutic goods that are in Australia that are available to the public meets a certain standard. Now, even before a drug can be registered on the TGA, it must first undergo a series of rigorous testing. They are clinical trials, which is the focus for today. And only when a drug is proven to be effective and safe can the pharmaceutical companies are able to apply for it to be registered in various regulatory bodies in different countries. And usually they go first to the US, so that's the FDA, Food Drug Administration, or Europe, that's the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, before they reach the TGA, the Australian TGA. So we're always a bit behind when it comes to access in new drugs. And so now it may take, of the thousands of agents that begin at this level, so I'm just going to go back here, of the thousands of agents that starts off here, perhaps only one or two is chosen to be developed into clinical treatment, so undergo clinical trials, of which only about 20% actually gets registered and a lesser percent become reimbursed for patient use. So it can take around 10 to 20 years for this to happen, from the time that the drug starts off in the laboratory to the time that it's available for public use. Now, some of my patients, some people I speak to, automatically assumes that just because you're in a clinical trial, it means that you're a guinea pig. So I just want to take one slide to explain the phases of clinical trials to clarify this matter. So the degree of guinea pigness or degree of uncertainty of whether or not a drug works depends on which stage of the clinical trials the drug has reached. So just very briefly, all new drug has to undergo first pre-clinical testing, and that's testing in animals or in cells to make sure that it works. And once it looks promising, they then go ahead towards phase 1 human studies. And the focus of phase 1 human studies is mainly safety. So to look at the to find the safest dose, the safest mode of delivery, and the safest schedule. And once that's determined, the drug then proceeds to phase 2 studies, whereby the focus here is to look at the preliminary efficacy in a more focused group of patients, a group of patients with particular cancers, for example, and then to look at more about expanded safety. By the time the drug reaches phase 3 clinical trials, we know that the drug works, we know that it's safe, we want to know now whether it's better compared to our current standard of care. And so often phase 3 trials involves randomisation, hundreds up to thousands of patients randomised to 2 arms, the investigational arm and the control arm. And the control arm usually represents the current standard of care. And if indeed the investigational agent is better than the current standard of care, then in the best circumstances it ought to be the new standard of care. And that's how we lift the standards of care for all our patients. So all that's well and good, but what does it mean for you? What about the patient journey perspective? So I've got a bit of a sore throat. So I can tell you it's not as straightforward as this. You're eligible for clinical trials, just sign here and let's go. Although I can tell you that a number of my elderly patients prefers it that way. The number of times I get patients saying, "Doctor, I trust you implicitly, just give it to me and I'll sign. No need to read, no need to read." It doesn't work that way. I think the consent process is probably one of the most important process in a clinical trial. You have to know what's been done to you, why it's been done to you, and what are the alternatives. And in fact, before any clinical trials can be executed in any institution, the protocol has to first undergo a rigorous process of review by the Institutional Ethics Committee. And only when it satisfies the national and institutional ethical standard will it be allowed to be executed. So, what constitutes as an ethical standard? I've got a number of clinical trials at the moment whereby one of the arms is a placebo arm, a sugar pill arm. And so my patients appropriately ask me, "Well, how is that ethical, doctor? You're giving me a sugar pill." Well, in fact, the ethical basis of clinical research in human rests on a principle called equipoise, and this is really important. Equipoise is a true state of uncertainty of whether or not the investigational agent is better than the control arm. And the control arm, as I said, usually represents the current standard of care. And if the current standard of care is to do nothing, then it would be appropriate to use a placebo pill or a sugar pill to represent that nothing. Now, the problem is that different clinicians have different threshold in believing whether or not the investigational agent works and how well it works. And rightfully or wrongfully, we impart that onto our patient. But just because I believe the drug to be effective doesn't mean it is. Because at this point in time, it's not proven. There's still equipoise, and that's why we're doing the clinical trial. Now, halfway through the clinical trial, if at an interim analysis it is found that arm A is better than arm B, then surely it's unethical to continue the trial. We have to stop the trial and recommend that the superior arm becomes standard of care and, if possible, allow patients to cross over. Okay? Now, I'll just give you an example of a current example of how a placebo or a number of placebo-controlled trials has basically lifted up the standard of care in cancer. And I keep referring to myeloma because that's my baby. I subspecialise in multiple myeloma. So multiple myeloma is an incurable blood cancer. The current standard of care of treatment of multiple myeloma is to allow patients to have upfront autologous stem cell transplant as part of their initial treatment. Now, up until a decade ago, it is common practice to do nothing after autologous stem cell transplant. We transplant patients and we leave them alone. That's it. And then up until a number of clinical trials were established to ask the question, is it better to continue patients on maintenance therapy after the transplant versus doing nothing like what we were doing then? And so a number of clinical trials were established, and these trials basically randomised patients to placebo, which was acceptable back then, or lenalidomide, which is a maintenance therapy, just a tablet. And it turned out that continuing patients on treatment in a maintenance fashion does indeed delay disease progression, so improve progression-free survival. Improve progression-free survival, so that's the red line there, the patient on lenalidomide versus placebo, and in turn improves overall survival. And because of this, it is now the current standard of care for patients to receive maintenance therapy post-autologous stem cell transplant around the world. Now, if at the moment there is a new drug, which there is, that claims to be even better for maintenance therapy, it is no longer ethical to compare that drug to placebo because the current standard of care is something. So we have to compare that drug to the current something, which is lenalidomide elsewhere, or in the case of Australia, thalidomide. Does that make sense? Okay, now back to the patient journey. So what is involved in the clinical trial? You can see here that even before a patient is recruited, there are a number of steps that must be followed. So it's not as straightforward as sign here and let's go. So even before a doctor introduces you to a clinical trial, he or she would have done his homework to see which trial benefits you and whether or not you're likely going to be eligible for a particular trial before introducing it to you in the clinic. But at that introduction in the clinic, perhaps some of the more pertinent questions that you could ask, or I would encourage all my patients to ask, is, well, how will this trial benefit me, doctor? Now, is it a phase 1, 2 or 3 clinical trial? Just to gauge in your mind how far along the developmental process is the drug, right? What are the expected side effects? So that's a common question. What are the frequency of the visits? Just practical questions. Am I going to be able to cope with all the visits that's demanded? Will I be reimbursed for my travel? Very practical. And importantly, if I choose not to participate in this clinical trial, what are the alternative options? It's very important for you to understand the alternative options. And so the doctor normally gives you then a patient information and consent form, and usually this is a document that contains all this information about the clinical trial. Unfortunately, most PICF is about 20 pages long, so I don't know how patients read it. I can't even read it. But you don't have to read it all at once. You take it home, you read it, you write all over it, you highlight it. It's not a Bible. You just scribble all over it, the questions. And then the whole point is that the doctor must give you enough time to read the PICF. We normally at St Vincent's give patients a week, and if treatment is more urgent, then we give patients at least 24 hours. You then come back to the clinic, and then this is a chance for you to ask more questions having read the patient information and consent form. So you're now in a better frame of mind now to ask more questions. But what I want you to remember is that before you sign the consent, ask all questions, but just because you've signed on the consent form, it doesn't mean that you're irreversibly locked in. You have the right to withdraw from the clinical trial at any point in time if you are concerned. And if the doctor is concerned about you, he or she will have the ethical responsibility to withdraw you out of the clinical trial as well. Only once the PICF, the patient information consent form, is signed, will the research team has the ability to initiate trial-specific investigations to see whether or not you are eligible for the clinical study. Now, just because your doctor thinks you're eligible doesn't mean you're eligible. So there's a list of inclusion and exclusion criteria that has to be met, and in my experience, up to 25% of patients fail this step and not be able to enrol into the clinical trial. But if you are deemed eligible, you are then enrolled, randomised, and then the real journey begins. So the real journey begins with you as the centre and a network of research staff around you, starting with the trial coordinators. The trial coordinators will be your best friend. Now, these are the people who coordinate every step of your care throughout the trial. And at St Vincent's, the trial coordinators are responsible for booking appointments, following patients to the clinics, following patients to the treatment, ensuring that the patient's reimbursed, etc. So a lot of my patients get more attached to the trial coordinators than me. Come Christmas time, I get a present and the trial coordinators get a present. So You also get more familiar with the nursing staff who will personally deliver the treatment to you. And then you'll see your doctor, the investigator, at regular intervals. The doctor will carry out the treatment in accordance to clinical trial protocol and dose adjust according to your side effects and how you're going. Now, those are the three groups of people you come into direct contact with, but there is a whole host of people behind the scene who are also involved in your care, starting off with the scientists. Now, the scientists will not know you personally, but they will know your blood and all the biological products that you've given consent to be collected. And so the results, the data from all the blood tests and all the clinical data from your doctor visits will be collated by the data managers of the clinical trials. All the data get entered into a central data program, then gets analysed statistically. Now, once the data is mature and a conclusion is reached, that is then the data will be made known public to the scientific community, normally in the form of presentation at international scientific conferences. And so when you come to a clinic and your doctor's never there, it's because he's gone to one of these conferences, and that's the reason. And usually it's followed up by a publication in a medical journal. And only the drugs in which there is efficacy proven, safety proven, will the pharmaceutical companies can then apply for the drug to be registered by regulatory bodies, TGA in our instances, and be made available to the public. So you can see that it's only through this process that novel effective therapeutic agents can be made available to the public. And so, and multiple myeloma is a prime example that has benefited from this process and in which the standard of care has been lifted. So even though it's an incurable cancer, the survival of multiple myeloma has significantly improved throughout the last several decades, and this can be directly attributed to the new treatment as a result of clinical trials. So back in the 1990s, all we had for multiple myeloma was just chemotherapy, and the median survival back then was less than 2 years. Fast forward to the current era, the median survival of multiple myeloma is quoted to be just below 6 years, and that's due to all the new therapeutic agents that's become available. Towards the future, this is what we expect for multiple myeloma in terms of survival. And that's because there is a plethora of novel therapeutic agents that's arisen in the horizon. And so, but you see, the only way that this can be translated into this is through clinical trials. And a recent example of this is a new group of drug for multiple myeloma called monoclonal antibodies. And I just want to spend one slide on this just as an example of successful clinical trials. So we've known for a long time that our immune system is one of the most powerful tools we have against cancer. Problem is that in most cancers, our immune system cannot recognise the cancer as being foreign, can't attack it. And in multiple myeloma, for a long time, we could not wake up the immune system. That is until about 6 years ago, when the first monoclonal antibody was developed against multiple myeloma called daratumumab. And so, just briefly, monoclonal antibodies are engineered antibodies that are engineered to recognise a specific marker on cancer cells, in this case the myeloma cells. And being an antibody, they do what antibodies do, which is they can attract the host, the patient's own immune effector cells, such as natural killer cells, which upon being in close proximity to the cancer cells can now recognise it and kill it. And so when daratumumab was first trialled in phase 1 clinical study, now remember how I said that phase 1 is only about safety. People were really surprised because they found a significant efficacy signal in that in a group of patients with a median 5 prior lines of treatment, or up to 14 in some cases, in whom you would expect a survival of about 6 to 9 months only, they saw a response rate in phase 1 trial of about 30% and the median survival of about 20 months. So these people were living twice as long as they should be. And so because of that, this drug then received a breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA to expedite it through clinical trials so it could be made available to the public. And since then, this drug has gone through a number of clinical trials in combination with the current backbone of standard of care, so DARA in combination with lenalidomide and dexamethasone, or DARA together with bortezomib and dexamethasone, compared to the current backbone on its own. And you can see in both cases, the combination of DARA with the backbone here and here is better than the backbone on its own. And so this photo is of a patient of mine who had directly benefited from one of the aforementioned trials. So this photo was published in one of the St. Vincent's newsletter article. So when she had relapsed myeloma that many years ago, she was in a lot of trouble, had no other treatment options, and was in dire strait. But this is 3.5 years on. She's still in ongoing complete remission. She's still on the clinical trial, receiving DARA once a month as a maintenance therapy, even though the trial has long closed. She's had excellent quality of life and won't come off the trial. So she's quite happy there. So finally, what could be done better? I think there's now an increasing recognition for the need of clinical trials in Australia and worldwide. And I think we've come a long way in Australia in a short period of time. But there are a number of things that could be done better, and I'm just going to briefly mention a few. First is, of course, increasing public awareness of the role of clinical trials, which is what we're doing here today, which is fantastic. One of the most important area of need that I see for Australia is the need for equitable access to novel therapeutic agents on clinical trials for patients in remote country areas. And so a lot of the clinical trials at the moment is run in tertiary centres in the city and some in metropolitan areas, but a lot of my patients in the country can't access these clinical trials because of the cost of travel and the logistics of distance. So we, as a country, need to do more to bring trials to these patients, i.e. improve the infrastructure in the remote areas or improve the services there in the long term, but at least in the short term, provide funding for these patients to come to the city to access these clinical trials. On a broader level, we need to establish clinical studies with regional relevance. And by that, I mean studies in which the results can be directly applicable to Australia. At the moment, the majority of, I wouldn't say, well, it is the majority, a significant proportion of clinical trials that we do are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. And that's because they own the drug. But because they're sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, they are designed to answer questions that are more pertinent to the interest of pharmaceutical companies. And sometimes the results cannot be directly applicable to Australia or the Asia-Pacific region in general, simply because the combination of the proposed drugs is simply too expensive. And so I think there's a significant need, a strong need to increase independent funding in Australia to allow investigator-initiated clinical trials. And these are trials that are initiated by us and not pharma, to ask the questions that are specific to our need and which can be applied to our healthcare system. And that's quite crucial. So I'm going to end there in the interest of time and leave you with this image. The road will not always be that pretty, but sometimes you just have to keep walking. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now, just before you go, I do want to ask you a question before you depart. So, one of the really interesting things about all the data around clinical trials is that patients that participate in cancer clinical trials have better survival than patients who do not take part in a clinical trial. Why might that be?
There are a number of reasons. In fact, I have patients who actually a number of patients at St. Vincent's who keeps wanting to be enrolled in the clinical trial because they think they get better care, which is probably true. There are two reasons. In clinical trials, the doctors, from a medical point of view, the doctors have to follow a specific protocol-driven way in how to manage patients. So the patients are reviewed on a regular basis. The patients are given a chance to articulate their side effects more to the doctors. The doctors are mandated to respond to those side effects by dose reductions or increasing in supportive care. So there's more of an interaction, more regimented interactions between doctors and patients. So that's from a medical point of view. From a psychological point of view, I think a lot of patients feel, and this is just my personal experience, more involved in clinical trials. They are more empowered in clinical trials because they know exactly what's going on, when it's going to happen, and they know what to anticipate compared to your average patient in the clinic whereby, you know, they see different doctors at different times. Despite the best attempt from the doctor's point of view, some patients may not know all the information they need to know about their treatment and they feel very insecure. So there's a psychological component, there is a medical component, and in depending on the trials that you're on, the treatment on the clinical trials are often cutting edge type of treatment that we can't access here on the PBS.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And here's a small gift.
Oh, that's
Thank
lovely.
you for your
Thank you.
great talk tonight. So I think that was a really clear exposition of what clinical trials are, what the journey is on clinical trials by Hung, and why we should do them. Those stunning differences in the survival outcomes for patients with the trials that Hung has been involved in and led herself is really quite remarkable. So great work, thank you. Okay, we'd now like to move on to the first of our clinical trial participant presentations this evening. And first of all, we'll hear from James Craig. Now, James actually is a patient of Hung's. And we welcome him very much. He had a type of cancer called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And James, I'm sometimes a bit nerdy, so this weekend I happened to just browse around the cancer survival rates in Victoria, asking myself the question, which cancers have there been biggest improvement in outcomes? And one of them was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The improvements in outcomes for patients with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma has been amazing due to clinical trials. So we're really looking forward to hearing about your experience. Thanks very much for coming and sharing that with us.
To think I survived just as I could stand here and talk to you people. Unbelievable. Yeah, well, I started off with the bad news, of course, like we all do. From there, I was at Peter Mac, where, they did a lot of search and destroy to find out what my problem was, at which time it was mentioned by someone, said to me, see if there's a trial. I thought, hey, I'm nearly paying the cheque now, so let's go for it. So when I asked, is there a trial, which you think yes or no? Yeah, you don't know. Fortunately for me, there was. So it was recommended that I go across to St. V's. So you fill out all the paperwork. You hope when you get there that they say, we want you. Yeah, it's a bit like Uncle Sam, isn't it? We want you. So, what can I say? They accepted me, put a smile on my dial, and then we started the program. It was 21 days apart. If I sound nervous, I don't do this regularly. So, whether I was the guinea pig or I got the placebo, I don't know that. But I'm standing here talking. That's more than I hoped for 2 years ago. And Hun, who gave you the last spiel, which is pretty hard to follow, but it's impressive work what she does. As for being at St. V's, it was good. The staff were good. They looked after you. They spoilt me. Some of the guys were characters, but then again, I am too, so we got along well. Like usual, hair fell out, big deal. Can't live without that. Most people do, apparently. But look at that, it's back. Who says chemo kills, eh? But obviously, it worked where it was supposed to work. It's been, 18 months, I think, now, since I've been in remission. And that's not bad, considering I only had 6 injections. I got out of it pretty easy, to tell you the truth. Most people, their body aches, pains, didn't do too bad in that area. Wasn't throwing up, so from what I was told to expect, I did pretty well. Surprised. Well, pins and needles, you get that. They tell you about side effects that look forward to. They monitor you every time you go. The staff come back, you fill out the paperwork. Yeah, You know, like the question says, how do you rate your health? Look where I am. How do I rate my health? Not good at the start. But after about the third trial or the third series of injections, the results were positive. I thought, well, how about that? So we continued on with what they were doing. Didn't have a problem. And then they asked questions like, why did you volunteer for a trial? Not that I want to be a guinea pig. I thought, yeah, got nothing to lose. Let's see if I can help someone else. If, you know, I've passed on, what they learn can help other people, then I've done something. I may have built half of Victoria in buildings, but this is something different. But otherwise, yeah, it wasn't too bad. My brother had leukemia when he was at 14. What I saw then to what I went through, huge improvements, and that can only come by trials. And then my brother bags me because, you know, when I tell him what I went through, he goes, mate, that was easy. But at least I bag him and say, hey, I still got hair. You didn't. So he lost most of his, but there are, you know, other things, but I think the trials are necessary. We've got to learn new stuff all the time. If we just live in the past, it gets worse for us. Our population in Victoria has probably doubled in the last 10 years. So there's going to be more people that are sick. Us guinea pigs, so to speak, as someone said earlier, but yeah, I'm a human. We're going to help other people further down the road, hopefully. And that's what it's about. Yeah. I've gotten through easy. Some people in our trial maybe went worse, I don't know. But we're all there with the problem. And we need scientists in the back, boffins in the back room to come up with these things, and we need to do our part to help them along with what they're doing. That's where we come from. Other than that, yeah, it was fun, in a strange way. Met some nice people in the hospital. Met some, Han, unbelievable what she does. And then, like, she's leaving here to go somewhere else to give another lecture. And then she gives you confidence. You go there, she tells you about your report, and you think, okay, it's better, it's better, it's better, it's better, it's better. You're cured. Okay, I don't know how much longer I'm going to go for, but I'm not going to quit. And that was the main goal when you get told, don't give up. Now, we know once that was a death sentence. I thought that with my little brother. I thought, no, I get it. I thought, that ain't going to happen. I've got a lot of people I still want to annoy. And the only way to do that is to get through it. I've sort of, got through it. Don't know what more I can say, but if there's more of me walking around, people in the background are doing the best thing possible.
What a fantastic story. Two things jumped out, James. One is your just incredible generosity, and it motivates a lot of people to help others by being enrolled in a clinical trial, and it was just beautiful the way you espoused that, James, so thank you so much. That's another round of applause. And the other key point that James made, which I loved, was the comparison of the difficulty with the treatment that your brother had to go through all those years ago compared to now, and how that is because of the advancement made through clinical trials. So that's a really, really powerful point. I think if we all take that message away tonight, it's very useful. Now, before we go into our next speaker, we're pretty informal tonight, so if you feel like you want to go and grab a drink or something, please just head out to the through the doors, and to the refreshments outside, that's fine. And also, just let everyone know, we've also got some people joining us online, and I'd like to welcome them, which I didn't do earlier. So if you're listening to our fantastic speakers online, you're very welcome. And I think we've got a question. Yes.
Question. I was a little puzzled that James didn't know whether he was on the placebo or the actual treatment.
Yeah.
And I would have thought when a trial was finished, that would be one of the bits of information that would be shared with you. And can you clarify that, please?
Yeah, let's deal with that now since you've raised it. I was actually going to raise that in the panel actually at the end because that's a key one. So some trials you find out very early what treatment you're allocated to, whether it was placebo or not. Others that require long-term follow-up you don't find out for quite some time later. It all depends on the science of the trial. So James, it still, to this day, you don't know whether you're on the placebo or not? No. And then I can put my hand up too because the trial I went on was also placebo-controlled and I still don't know to this day whether I was on that. So I suspect, James, you and I, both motivated by adding to knowledge. We know we were going to get great care no matter what arm of the trial you were on. It's a bit different if that might influence your treatment down the line. So we do have a routine in clinical trials that we have unblinding and find out whether you're on the placebo or not if it is absolutely essential in defining your next treatment or for safety reasons. But yeah, sometimes you don't find out for quite some time until the trial is fully reported its results, and then you can make inquiries of the trials team as to what treatment you were on.
So as an example, what would be the period of time that the trial James is on? Until from start to finish, and then you might find out.
It's been 2 years and I'm still going back.
Yeah, you don't know how long it's going to last.
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the endpoints of the trial, and we haven't got Hung here to fill us in on the details. But sometimes if there's very long-term follow-up for survival, that it can be quite some time before there's any unblinding of that trial information. All right, so let's move on now to our third speaker, which is Julie Zerner. Welcome, Julie. Now, Julie has had breast cancer, and Julie also on the weekend when I was looking around all of the how we're doing in different types of cancer, as well as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, breast cancer is the other one where we've had really striking improvements in outcomes, and unquestionably that's related to clinical trials, to information obtained from clinical trials, and not just drug treatments. We've heard from Kwang and James about drug treatments, but in fact the improvements in breast cancer survival are due to a whole range of different types of trials, which we might touch on at the end. But Julie, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your story.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel very privileged to be here. My journey, I actually don't like the term journey because it's a trip of a lifetime, really, that I didn't want to take. But that is my journey, and I'm here. I was first diagnosed with breast cancer in 2007. I went through surgery. I went through chemo, I went through radiation, I went through hormone treatment. And you know what? I thought, that's it. I'm doing well, I'm okay. But it came back. And I think that's probably one of the hard things that we have to deal with, is looking and thinking, well, it's come back, so now what do I do about it? I live in Mildura, so I'm one of the rural patients that Hung was talking about. And in Mildura, we are so lucky that we have a group of fly-in, fly-out specialists who visit us on a regular basis. But we also have our own oncologist who is resident and lives there. So I was originally under the care of an oncologist in Melbourne, and then I went to the care of the local oncologist when my cancer returned. And he was wonderful, and he put me on best standard practice with a drug called letrozole. which is the drug of the current treatment. And like all the good people, I went home and Googled to find out what it was about and what would it do and what would happen. And as I was Googling all the things that came up, there was a press release about a new drug that was given in addition to the letrozole. And but it was not available in Australia. It was quite commonly used in Europe, in the UK and in the US, but had not reached Australia yet. And there were some people in Australia who were able to access this drug, but it was overseas at around about $10,000 a month. I went to my oncologist and showed him the press release and said, is this something that we need to think about and that we could talk about? And he said, absolutely, we can. We can think about how you can gain access to that extra drug and what we can do about it. I think he rang every hospital in Australia to see if it was available and if there was a clinical trial available that would allow me to access the drug. He finally found the most marvellous people at Sunshine Hospital, Western Health, which I call Sunshine Hospital, because that's where I go, and they were absolutely fantastic. And they said, yes, we are recruiting. So it meant that I had access to a drug that was prohibitive in terms of expense, normally in Australia. Since I started, or since the press release that came out, the drug company Pfizer has put in to the PBS to have it listed on PBS, and they weren't successful in their first submission. But they did say that it was available for self-funding in Australia, so people could fund themselves. That took the price down, I think, to $5,000 a month. And since then, in the last budget, a different but very similar drug is going to be listed on the PBS, but the one that I'm on isn't on the PBS as yet. So being part of the clinical trial allowed me to access that drug, which I would not have been able to access otherwise. So I felt that I was very privileged to do that. I'm actually not quite sure. My understanding is that I'm on a phase 4 of a trial. So I don't know where. I think it's this side of Hung's slide, really. Yes, it works, and yes, it is successful, and yes, it does give you a better quality of life, but we want more data. We want to learn more about it, is my understanding that goes through. I knew that I had an absolute marvellous team in Mildura who were looking after me and who were caring for me, and I could not say enough for what they have done. They're just at the end of the phone. Whenever I call them, they're there, they're available, and they explain things, they go through things. But I knew as part of a clinical trial, I would have access to another group, a whole other team of people, and that would give me additional care. And I knew that for me was really, really important. Also, like everybody else who's part of a clinical trial, I hope that what I go through and what people learn from the trial and from my little bit of data that goes in will help other people down the track. I know with breast cancer there are incredible things are happening, and I would like to hope that they continue to happen so that I can come back and visit you down the track. I did find out about the clinical trial by reading the press release. Since then, and the drug I'm on is palbociclib, it has received a lot of publicity since then, so that there's very much a push to have it listed and to have it worked through. So it is a drug now that is quite recognised, but still not accessible unless you're on a clinical trial. So that was the important part for me. And that was when I discussed it all with my oncologist who worked through. After contacting Sunshine Hospital, the oncologist then discovered that the hospital was recruiting patients, and so we had to go through, as Hung said, there was a process to go through to see if I was eligible to be part of the trial, if what I had would be okay, if I could be part of the type of cancer I had, the stage of cancer, the previous treatment that I'd had, and any other medical issues that I might have had, which may have made me ineligible to participate. So we went through all of those processes to just establish my eligibility and to make sure that I was okay to go ahead. I was accepted on the trial, and I did receive the 20-page consent form to be signed, which I was very grateful for because it explained a lot of the things in there that the process that we would be going through, what the expectations would be, what might happen in terms of my expectations, what would happen in terms of the expectations from the hospital and from the clinical trial people. What might be my side effects, the possible side effects that might be there, and other sorts of issues that we're going through. So having gone through all that, I dutifully signed at the bottom line, thinking I'm just so glad that I have access to something that is cutting-edge treatment. And that really was my aim at that time, was to be part of what was going on there. I then had tests and scans to provide a baseline for where my cancer was, so that during the trial period, the results could be checked against that and they could see progression or non-progression or what might be happening. What did I get out of being part of the clinical trial? I think that the ability to receive a drug that is giving me a quality of life that I don't know whether I would have had without it or not. I don't know. But it allows me to go back to work. I work part-time, so I've gone back to work part-time. It allowed me to complete my research for my thesis and write up my thesis. It allowed me to graduate with my PhD. So it gave me the opportunity to take my life forward, which I'm very grateful that I have had that opportunity. It allowed me to establish a relationship with the most incredible new medical team. The people at Sunshine Hospital have been fantastic, and I now have a relationship with them that I feel I can call them at any time, I can contact them at any time, and they're there for me and they're working with me in that very positive way. But also it's the opportunity to learn about clinical trials and to learn about what is happening in terms of new research and the things that are going on, because through participating in the clinical trial, I have information that helps me think about where I might be going and what are the other sorts of trials that might be happening, that might be down the track. There are issues, and I faced a few issues. As a rural patient, and I live in Mildura, so there's no further place from Victoria or from Melbourne than Mildura. So right up in Mildura, it is quite difficult. I need to put aside extra time. I have to come down to Sunshine Hospital once a month for what in my family is called my drug run. So I come down once a month and access the drugs. So I need to put aside time to do that, to travel from Mildura. It's 550 kilometres each way. I have to fly. I can't drive each time. And so I have to fly down, and it takes a day to go down and go to the hospital and have the checkups and things and go back again. It is hard in that when I first started on the palbociclib, getting my blood counts right and getting the schedule right and the dosage right was quite difficult and took quite a lot of time, which meant that I was all set with my airfare and my air ticket that then had to be changed. So that emotionally, as well as financially, was a bit difficult. It is difficult for rural people to be part of clinical trials. There is no patient assistance travel if you're on a clinical trial. There is for normal treatment, that's terrible, isn't it? It is for best standard treatment. If you are required to come down to Melbourne for treatment, then you have patient travel assistance. But being on a clinical trial, there is no travel assistance. And so I'm very lucky. My husband, who's sitting over there, supports me to the hilt, and we pay for me to come down once a month, fly down once a month, so that I can be part of that clinical trial. My oncologist did say that he was more than happy to be part of all that, but because of the clinical trial and the protocols that are associated with the clinical trial, he could not do that. So it had to be done through the Sunshine Hospital. Finally, can I just say, participating in a clinical trial has been a fantastic experience for me. The support I have received and continue to receive, both from the team in Mildura and the team at Sunshine Hospital, has been fantastic. It just is amazing. It's allowed me to think about my cancer, which I know is incurable and I know is terminal, but I can move forward with my life in a way that is very positive, and I meet people and they have no idea that I'm dealing with that. So that gives me a privacy that allows me to move forward and allows me to work through. And that's a very important part of the care and the quality of life as you work through. So I can lead my life to the fullest. I don't consider myself to be sick. I don't feel sick. I don't think I look sick. But I have to deal with the fact that, yes, I have cancer and we're working through it. And my GP says to me, well, Julie, what's the worst thing? It's come back. What do? We treat it and we buy you more time. And I think that is a very, very wonderful way of thinking about it. I feel that we are so fortunate in Australia, or particularly in Melbourne, to have the research that we have here. I think that the scientists, everybody involved in the research that is happening just is amazing. They are such a dedicated and committed group of people who are doing absolutely everything, punching way above their weight, to make sure that the best treatment is available for we the patients. And I just can't thank you all enough. For those of you in the audience who are part of that, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. For those of you in the audience who are considering going on a clinical trial, do it, is what I say. Just do it, because it has been, for me personally, a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for sharing your personal experience there. Very, very moving. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I wasn't aware until just now that we need to give you congratulations, Dr. Julie Sverner, for getting your PhD. So. I love that. The managing to get a PhD after beginning on a clinical trial is absolutely fantastic. So congratulations. Now, final speaker before we move to our panel discussion with you all is Professor Mark Rosenthal. So Professor Rosenthal is a senior staff specialist in the Department of Medical Oncology at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre, and he's director of the Parkville Cancer Clinical Trials Unit. So Mark is actually responsible for running over, at the moment, I think, Mark, over 180 clinical trials in this facility. So, and a very, very experienced clinical trialist. So Mark, we look forward to hearing your perspective about clinical trials in Victoria.
Thank you. And James doesn't need to wear a jacket, nor do I. Look, the talk so far really resonated with me. Every comment is virtually something I think of, except, Julie, the last bit about giving your life some control. I think that's something I hadn't thought about, just understanding where you are and what you're doing. I think that's a really important point. But what you'll hear from me is actually echoing what's been said by all three speakers so far. I turned 58 last week, and I reckon for 50 years I've been dressing myself. So you might want to have a vote at some stage about the tie and the shirt, because my wife has come back from New York and she's now putting shirts and ties together. This one I put on in the dark this morning. And I'll tell you why. Actually, the comment about why do patients do better on clinical trials, it's because they don't get the Mark Rosenthal near enough is good enough approach, which is how I do things at home. And it's exactly right. It's all protocol driven. It's very precise. So the Mark Rosenthal near enough is good enough with the dose, or what I'm much better with clinical trials. So I'm just going to start off by showing some numbers. So this is the Australia-New Zealand Clinical Trial Registry, 10 years of data. 10,000 trials, not just cancer, this is all trials. 5 million patients have been on trials. About 20% of the trials are cancer trials. About half are drug trials. There's lots of health economics. Don't know if anyone's particularly interested, but for every dollar that's put into clinical trials and clinical research, you get $5 in health benefits. $1 billion in commercial investments. About 40% are sponsored. And there are some interesting trends too, which we need to be aware of. More non-commercial trials. So we talked about the investigator-initiated trials already. And this is interesting for me because maybe 10 years ago, our clinical trials unit said, you know what, I reckon we're going to be doing more of the phase 1, the early drug development trials, rather than the big phase 3s. And in fact, it's increased dramatically from 9% to 22%. So not that interesting, is it? Because it's all personal. And I was delighted to see one patient up there on a photo with myeloma, 2 patients here. It is all personal. And I'm going to tell 3 very quick stories. Peter B, Peter W and Sarah. So Peter Barlow, he had a glioblastoma. That's a brain cancer. That's what I do. It's an interesting point. I was thinking, Grant, when you said you were looking at what's got so much better, brain cancer, what I do, 1 new drug in 20 years. Does that mean we're not doing well? No, actually, the care of brain cancer patients has improved unbelievably from what it was. And part of that is the clinical trial portfolio. So this was a drug that was a first in human study, first patient in the world. Here it is, AMG 595 actually. I don't care what anybody knows about science or biochemistry, that looks like a poison. And that's sure enough what it was. And Peter Barlow was brave enough to sit in a chair in our day centre, put his arm out and say, give me that drug. First patient in the world to get that thing. Pretty amazing. And in fact, he was fortunate, and it's another point. Not every drug that goes into a trial ends up at market. So, 90% of patients don't always respond. The companies say, that's it. They're not going ahead. You can do the phase 1, but not the phase 2 and the phase 3. But that doesn't mean that patients can't benefit from being on a trial, because Peter Barlow was the 1 in 35 patients who responded to that drug. The company killed the drug because it wasn't good enough, but he was fortunate. And there's his cancer sitting back there. 2 years later, none there. Unbelievable. But how brave to put your arm out and take that stuff. And here he is. And one of my great, great moments in my career was bringing the scientist who came up with that drug, John Hill, who I knew, and Peter and his wife, and brought them into a room together. And there were tears. It was a fabulous moment. Peter Ward, how lucky. So, brain cancer again, a drug called Avastin. The Americans thought it was brilliant. I didn't, but anyway. Not that many people responded, but Peter Barlow not only responded, but lived for 2 years. And Peter was a magnificent guy. This is Muhammad Ali getting Peter's signature. Peter was a Herald Sun photographer. He was very famous. He came up with this photo, which was from the Walkley Awards in 1996, and I remembered it. This was at Richmond Tech, I think, and it was forestry protesters, and the police had found this nifty way of rendering protesters unconscious. And Peter took this photo. That's Peter when he was in Vietnam. He took great photos, and some of you might remember the pensioners took their tops off in front of Flinders Street Station. And the other good thing was he used to come to my son's footy and take incredible action photos. So Peter went for 2 years, and that was a surprise. Lucky. This is only a few weeks before his death, and I don't normally go to wakes or pre-wakes, but I'm holding Peter up. He couldn't stand. You can see the chair in the background. This is a cake that looks like a camera. And the Richmond jumper was because Peter was a mental Richmond supporter, and I had to go out and buy this rotten Richmond jumper. So, it was just a magical moment. That was a magical moment to be there. And then Sarah C., how brave. Oh, this was just a shocking story. Another brain cancer patient. First time in human studies. So it was the same one as the first patient got. You needed to have a gene abnormality in your cancer to get onto the trial. 1 in 3 chance. And she was actually an excellent candidate in every other way. We needed to get consent to test the tumour. Not to get on the trial, but to test the tumour. And it wasn't easy. She came from Murrelbach. She was paralysed down one side. She had 2 little kids, like a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old, and getting in and out of the car was almost impossible. Not that impossible that she couldn't go on a trial. Now, I've never shown this slide, and I don't know what Grant will have a stroke probably, but I decided I was going to get consent and give her the opportunity to get onto this trial. And where do we do it? In the car. Now, you've got to be on hospital property. I think that's the rule. So there it is, just outside. So Mum rang me and said, we're just coming around the corner to Grattan Street, and I got consent, not for my benefit, but for Sarah's benefit. And again, a magical moment. So it's all personal. Trial medicine's good medicine. Care is better. Attention to detail is protocol driven. Not the Mark Rosenthal near enough's good enough. Outcomes are better. I'm sure they are. What it does is it provides options and opportunity. I gave a consent form to a patient this morning. Brain cancer, incredible drug. He's thinking about surgery, the trial, okay. So, he's got 2 options, not 1. So trials are about options and opportunities, not feeling like you've got to fly to New York with $500,000 in your pocket to get onto a trial. No, the New Yorkers should be coming here, for my trials anyway. It provides early access to new drugs. So we know the patients do get onto trials here, in Australia, in Melbourne, in Victoria, where new drugs are sort of being developed and they get early access. I'll come back to that. And I think we've heard about hope and optimism. The altruism is a really important point. And I said this morning to my patient who said, if it doesn't work on me, maybe it'll help someone else. And I said, that's absolutely right. But I want this drug to work on you. It's about you, not about the next generation or something. The altruism is fantastic. And I really admire that. But the focus is on the patient. And for medical science, what works, what doesn't work, what might work, how to move forward. Global winners are infrequent. Cost a lot of money to run these trials. And winners coming from local science, something that's come up in a lab at Western or St V's or WeHi, the uni, and take it into the clinic and has been a success, it's very uncommon. But incremental improvements occur all the time. And we saw that with the myeloma studies. But when it happens, it is unbelievable. So this photo, is in so deep in my heart. It was on my old boss's shelf for 25 years. Every time I walked past his room, I saw that photo. So this is Don Metcalf, very famous scientist, my old boss, Dick Fox, a great medical oncologist, George Morstan, the first patient in the world. So just like Peter Barlow, put his arm out and said, give me GCSF. And that is just a magnificent moment in my mind. It's about scientific inquiry, seizing the moment, brilliance, collaboration, training and education, bench to bed, generosity of spirit, mentorship, breakthroughs. Actually, these guys are now forgotten. So, all three of them I worked with for 20 or 30 years. But if you're about 10 or 15 years younger than me, probably not known. So we can't rely on individuals. It's fundamental to our work and our culture. So here's another example, which is actually a little bit more recent. David Vo was a medical student in my year. He was the class clown, but he happened to discover what a specific gene does, BCL2. We all knew that cancers grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, but no one had actually thought cancers don't die properly. And David Vo discovered that cancers don't die. In fact, what happened was the cells had that gene in them. He couldn't be bothered coming in over the weekend and the cells were still alive on the Monday. And someone went, hello, cancer cells don't die. So that was 1988, 30 years ago. Here's a recent photo of me, 20 years ago. But this sort of captures that first photo I showed. People around the bedside working together. And the guy in the middle, Andrew Roberts, has worked on this program probably for 20 odd years. And this was one of the most unbelievable papers I think that's ever come out of Australia. And Andrew Roberts was the first author. It's a new drug called venetoclax. It's a drug that's used in lymphomas and other haematological malignancies. It's revolutionised the field such that, that these are local people. John Seymour from here, St V's, Contam. These are New England Journal papers, the most revealed journal in the world. Unbelievable that this has come out of Victoria. Like the GCSF, but it's 30 years later. In fact, I love the story Andrew tells of the very first patient who got venetoclax. He had lymph glands like this. And Andrew, they gave the treatment. Andrew went back a couple of hours later and said, just to make sure he hadn't killed him, done something terrible, there was some terrible side effect. And Andrew said, how are you going? And the guy said, yeah, it's working. 4 hours later. So this is just a remarkable breakthrough, but it is rare. Okay, negative trials. Oh, gee, we didn't get a positive trial. Those special curves were shown, which are like that. They're like that. That's a bad thing? No, it's not. Because negative trials aren't negative. This drug Avastin in brain cancer, the Americans in the late 2007 thought it was unbelievable. That's because they couldn't read the MRI scans properly. We were pretty suspicious that it wasn't working so well. Because the Americans said this drug, which is an expensive drug, $3,500 a month, you might be on it like Peter Ward. Actually, that's a good point to make, Mark. Peter Ward was on it for 2 years, $3,500 times 24, it's a lot of money. Early access to a new treatment. So the Americans always said the response rate's high. You've got to give it with some chemotherapy, so extra toxicities and side effects. And you've got to continue when the tumour's getting worse. You've got to keep going with the Avastin and just change the chemotherapy. Otherwise, your brain's going to explode or do something terrible. Right, so we did a trial in Australia, and this is one of these trials that was already mentioned. Not really sponsored by one of the pharmaceutical companies. This is an investigator-initiated trial. Catherine Field was the young PI, did a brilliant job. Biggest and best brain cancer trial ever done in Australia. 120 patients in about 12 months. And we came up, it was called Cabaret, we came up with this. Response rate high? No, low. Give with chemotherapy was essential? No, it wasn't. Continue at progression? No, and don't be ridiculous. So Catherine actually, when she started to present this, kept saying it's a negative study, sorry, it's a negative study. I said, no, we have challenged 3 dogma and we have changed international practice through a negative study. So it's not negative. It's actually challenged dogma and made a huge difference to the way we look after our patients. So there's been a few questions about what are we going to do and how do we do things, and how might we get the patient from Mildura, my favourite regional centre. When I do this talk, I always say from Mildura to Mallacoota, we want to try and help all of those patients. And so the VCCC Strategic Research Plan has just got underway. That's $20 million from state government, thank you, to try and increase and improve clinical trials. We want to expand clinical trials for patients. I mean, this is about research discoveries and new treatments, and they're going to drive our clinical care. We've got some fancy new approaches to clinical trials, things that we haven't done before. Registry trials, a new way of doing clinical trials. Tele-trials, hello. Let's try and make sure that you don't have to travel all the way down to Sunshine. Somehow work out. So we do telehealth. That's becoming a little bit more regular. We do it in our clinic. This morning, my neurosurgeon, I could hear she was doing a teletrial because she was shouting at the computer screen. I had to go in and say, indoor voice, please. So we're doing telehealth. We're going to change it to teletrials. Let's get the patients in Mildura having their trials done in Mildura. It's not easy, it's complicated, but we're going to get there. Awareness of clinical trials. You were talking about, James mentioned as well, how do you fall into, most people fall into a clinical trial. If you come and see me, it's clinical trial, clinical trial, clinical trial. But not everybody thinks like that. And not everybody's aware of clinical trials. I want a system where you just push a button and up it comes. It's easy. I want posters, advertising, I don't care. I want everybody to have access to clinical trials. This is adolescent and young adults. There's a problem if you are 17, 500 metres down the road, you can't get onto most clinical trials because the bottom age limit is 18. So if you're 17 and 18, there's a huge disparity. So we're going to get rid of that disparity. Most cancer trials are done by medical oncologists, people like me, haematologists, not really by physios, not really by occupational therapists. Radiation oncologists do them, surgeons struggle a bit. They don't have the wherewithal, the experience, the expertise. We've been doing it for 30 years since that original photo. We've worked out how to do it. It's core business for us. And so what we want is other groups to become, slowly but surely, experts in the field. Palliative care, for example. Very small clinical trial program in cancer. Wow, what an opportunity. And we know patients, even in their last month of life, are prepared to go on clinical trials and want to do so. We're going to try and make things more efficient, of course, and this comes back, investigator-initiated trial capacity building. This is the idea that it's not just Roche, BMS, Pfizer doing the clinical trials. It'll be investigators, doctors, physios, occupational therapists, doesn't matter who, come up with a good idea, give them help to take it into a protocol, get the protocol running, and come up with some interesting questions. We've got a simple one in brain cancer. You're supposed to give 6 months of chemotherapy after the original surgery. There's been a sort of a frame shift. So in America, of course, double must be better. Everyone gets 12. That does not make sense. Equipoise, which is the word used, should it be 6, should it be 12? Well, we're going to do a trial 6 versus 12. I'm cool about that. I don't know which one's better. I do know it would be great if it's just 6, because that's 6 extra months patients have been doing unnecessarily. So we can do trials that no pharmaceutical company is going to do. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve access. So from Mildura to Mallacoota, you have the same access if you live around the corner in Errol Street, North Melbourne. Everybody has the same opportunity. And that then falls into participation. No one has to go on a clinical trial if you don't want to. Clinical trials are there as opportunities, other options. And we want people, wherever they might be in Victoria, to have those opportunities. And that's about equity. So it's no different wherever you are, whether you speak English or not, whether you old or young, everybody gets the opportunity. And investigators. Medical oncologists and haematologists have run clinical trials in cancer medicine for 30 or 40, 50 years. But where's the good question about exercise, for example? Many of you would have seen, it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, exercise, big deal. We sort of knew that. Am I going to do an exercise study? No. Look at me. It's not what I do. So where's the physiotherapist or the, phys ed trainer, whoever? Where's the physio who can help us with the idea about exercise, and then we help them come up with a new strategy? How do you find out about clinical trials? I've said already, there should be a push of a button somewhere. There should be posters everywhere. Patients should be walking into a hospital and saying, which trial can I go on? Not everybody has to go on a trial. I think the best thing is ask your doctor, which is, I think, what you both said. Ask your doctor. I think the second most important thing is ask your doctor, and third is ask your doctor. There are ways and means. So the Cancer Council of Victoria has got a website, a clinical trials link, which is very good. But I think you've got to put pressure on your doctor. And if they don't know, ask someone else. Most medical oncologists, haematologists, cancer specialists are pretty aware of the environment. If they don't know themselves, they know to ask me or Grant or someone else. So I'm just going to finish up. Trial medicine is good medicine. That's my aphorism, but I've changed it to great medicine. You do get looked after better. Grant, I'm sure, is going to ask some interesting questions. I do know that we did an exit study, patients who came off clinical trials and came back to me. And of course, what was the answer? They didn't like coming back to me because they've been looked after so well on the trial, and I can't provide that sort of care. Trial medicine exists for our patients. It is entirely personal. And I keep this is just one page of my list on my board in front of my desk. I see it every day, and that's a list of maybe a quarter of the patients I've ever put on a clinical trial. And occasionally I just run my eye down it. I think, can't remember her, can't remember him, can't remember her. And then I go, wow, what a magic person that was. So that list is very important to me, and it sits there right in front. So I'll finish and leave the front.
Thanks, Mark. So I think you understand now why cancer specialists are so passionate about clinical trials after hearing Mark speak. So we're going to move now into a facilitated discussion. So I'll ask our two patients, Julie and James, if you'd like to join us up the front here, and Mark. And I'd also like to introduce Anne Willett. So Anne is the head of clinical trial programs at the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre. So, Anne, thank you for joining us. So we're able to take some questions from the audience, but I might do warming up question. And we haven't heard from Anne, so Anne, I've got to start with yourself. So Mark talked about teletrials as an answer to Julie's problem of living in Mildura and having to pay for her flights down to Sunshine. Maybe just explain a little bit more to the audience what is a teletrial and why you think it'll make a difference.
Sure. So teletrials is a new way of delivering cancer care. So what we anticipate is we've got a couple of different models, but what we anticipate is that there will be a patient will be so for example, in Mildura Hospital, they will be there with their local oncologist, and they will dial down using video teleconferencing to the oncologist that's based in Melbourne that is running the trial, and the doctor in Melbourne will check the eligibility with the oncologist in Mildura, ask about all the eligibility criteria. Are you suitable for a trial? The person in Melbourne will do the checklist. They will send up a consent form to Mildura, so the doctor in Mildura will be able to go through the consent form, and then the patient and the doctor in Mildura will have a chance to check with the doctor in Melbourne that they are happy, they've answered all the questions, and then depending on the level of experience and the level of confidence and the services and the resources that are available, some of the treatment may be able to be given at a regional or a rural setting. So that is sort of basically what we hope to roll out. There'll be different levels depending on level of experience and confidence, and does the local hospital have a chemotherapy unit. So some small hospitals may not have all the resources that are available, so they may have to come to Melbourne for some visits, or they may be able to have all their visits delivered locally. So that's our aim, and we're just working through how we actually get the drug to a regional centre, how we transfer all the information, how we report side effects and improvements in care.
Now, I think Professor Passion Mark Rosenthal wants to make a comment as well.
So there are some trials that should not be done in regional centres. So the trial I was trying to get the patient on this morning, 7 days in hospital is required. It's too much. It's too complicated. There's only 1 or 2 hospitals in Melbourne that can do that sort of trial. So it's also about the trial portfolio. There are trials we should not be doing in specialist centres. They can be done in regional centres and in the sort of outer metropolitan hospitals. And in fact, not just teletrials metro to region. How about teletrials from Sunshine to the Austin? Or teletrials from the Austin to Royal Melbourne? Because the portfolio of trials, we all try and do everything, and we've got to be much more rational about our trials. And so wouldn't it be terrific if you lived in Hoppers Crossing and there was a great trial at the Austin, but you think, that's as far, probably not from Mildura, but it's an hour and a half's drive. Let's have teletrials as a mechanism between hospital in Melbourne.
Yeah, I think that's very exciting. Now, we might go to the audience because I think we've got some questions.
Hi, good evening, all of you. My question is for Dr. Mark. I have done Masters in Biotechnology, and I'm willing to help as a volunteer what you're doing for clinical trials. Is there any procedure to follow as a volunteer? Because I face so many difficulties. I'm, meeting them personally, and I'm disappointed with that.
So, the doctors do about this much work, and then the research staff, whether they're research nurses or study coordinators, they do the bulk of the work and have to look over our shoulders and make sure we do the right thing, because, in fact, trials have become so complicated. And the patient I saw today, I actually took the protocol down and I was reading the protocol and the PICF before he came in just to make sure I had it clear. It's so complicated. What I would say is that there is a shortage of staff for research staff, either as nursing staff or as study coordinators around Victoria. Regional centres are screaming out. There is a way of getting in, and we had a trials unit meeting here, sort of an open day almost, to try and attract people, and the place was packed, 240 people. So there is a reason to. You've got to start a bit low and work your way up if you've never been in it. But I think keep your eyes out for a position. They're advertised all the time, and just look out.
And VCCC, Anne, are investing some resources in people that come from a science background to get skilled up in clinical trials. Just a couple of quick words on that, perhaps.
So we have a workforce program where we're trying to build, so we'll do a 40-week rotation through some of our bigger cancer centres to get people trained up, and then hopefully they will be a preferred person for jobs in the future.
So it's actually a really key issue. Now, I think we've got another couple of questions.
Yes, sorry, it's just seeking a point of clarification. When you actually look for candidates to participate in your trials, do you actually do something like a DNA cross-section to see if they're actually prone to a specific cancer or otherwise?
So the trials come in all shapes and sizes. So there are generic trials. If you've got bowel cancer that's spread, you can go on the trial. Then brain cancer, for my type of cancers, there are trials, all comers. Then there are trials for over 70. Then there are trials if you've got a particular gene abnormality, and the treatment is for that gene abnormality, and there's no point being on that treatment if you don't have it. So there are some studies where everybody could go on, some studies that are much more related to age, and then studies which are very specific to a genetic abnormality in the tumour, not in the patient. And our experience, we had one study where we tested, we knew that the gene abnormality was 5%. We thought, well, if we find 1 or 2 brain cancer patients with that, great. We tested 55 patients and none had it. That's just bad luck. But, at least that was an option for the patients and they were all willing, did the right thing.
Maybe might ask Julie and then James to make comment here as well, because in some clinical trials, patients and participants are invited to have their blood tested for their genes to determine whether there might be something to be discovered in the genetic basis of their disease or the response to the drug. Julie and then James, did you get asked to participate in such what we often call it as a sub-study? Did either of you get asked to participate in such a sub-study? So we're shaking our heads.
That was a quick no from both of us.
Now I'm going to really put you on the spot now. So what if you were asked? So if the question was, would you donate some extra blood in order to determine whether there's anything in your genes that may determine why you respond or don't respond to a treatment, or even if there's any link with the type of cancer that you have to your genetics? Would you participate in such a so-called sub-study?
I would do anything to participate. I would absolutely do anything.
Yep.
And in fact, I hope that when I have to go off the trial that I'm on now, that I can find another one
Right.
that I can go on to. Mind you, the people who take my blood every month may not agree with me, as they work very hard to find a vein. But yes, I would. I don't know.
And James, what about yourself?
Blood left.
So James, you'd be happy to sign up to such a study if approached as well? Because we actually have, for that sort of study, it's a great question, I'm glad it was asked. We actually often have a separate consent form because it's considered very special to test your genes as to whether you're predisposed to some aspect of the trial or the disease under study. Now, I think we have another question up the front.
Yes, I have a question. You were talking about how there are a greater percentage of phase 1 trials now than in the past. What factors are leading to that trend?
Look, I can only speak for our trials unit here. 40% of our trials are first time in human, phase 1 early drug development. I think academic interest, ability to do it. Grant, I think it's it's the cutting edge, it's the most interesting, the most exciting. Most of my trials that I've done, I've probably done 70 or 80. I reckon 1 or 2 have ended up in a drug that went to market. Now, Peter Barlow, that first patient, is exactly the sort of example of someone who benefited, but the drug never went anywhere because most people didn't. And whatever my next trial is, that's going to be the one that goes fantastically well. In my heart, that's what I believe. So I'm optimistic. I don't do a trial unless, well, actually, I said to the patient today, if I was, he said, what would you do? I said, if I was sitting in that seat, I'd go on this trial instantly. I really believe that. And I don't think any of us would ever be trying to consent a patient for a trial that they didn't believe in.
Actually, the other, I guess, interesting aspect, Mark, is that Australia's pretty good at phase 1 trials, right? I mean, there's a lot of pharmaceutical companies and biotechnology companies all around the world that are turning to Australia as almost sometimes the first port of call for a phase 1 trial. Why is that, Mark, do you think?
Because we're bloody good at it. We've actually, that old photo is the start of the phase 1 program, and it's been a 30-year journey of mentoring and teaching, and it's just been handed down and down. And so not every hospital can do it, not every hospital should do it, but most of the trials that we do as phase 1, first time in human studies, it'll be Peter Mac, the Austin, maybe Monash, New York something, Boston something, and one other. We are as good as anywhere. In fact, this is sort of slightly irrelevant, but the fellows, so these are sort of the junior consultants or the senior registrars, we've worked out that they're better off probably training here. So these are Australian fellows than going overseas. Everyone used to feel they had to go overseas to get good training, a bit of a cultural cringe, and we all did it. But now we reckon we're so good here that the fellows ought to spend 2 or 3 years training here, come from Sydney or Perth or somewhere, and train here rather than going to New York or London or elsewhere.
Okay, I think we've got another question over here.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi there, I'm Johnny. I'm a doctor with a software company. I've got 2 parts of the question. Perhaps first for Julie and James. How did you both deal with the uncertainty of being enrolled in a trial? And then perhaps for our experts, is that something that we're concerned about for our patients? Are we doing anything, or what other supports that we have? So for Julie and James first, how did you deal with the uncertainty?
Do you want to go to me? It is an emotional roller coaster. I think the whole diagnosis, just being told you have cancer, is an emotional time that we all deal with in our own way, and we all deal with it differently. For me, I felt very positive about the opportunity to be participating in a trial. I don't think I even thought what would happen if I wasn't able to be part of it. That was maybe I was being a little bit blind on that part, but I wanted to be involved, and I was going to make sure it would happen for me. Now, if my cancer had been the kind that wasn't appropriate for that trial, then I would have dealt with that at that time and perhaps looked for something else and worked in a different way. But I guess I approached it by, when that decision is made, then I will work out how I will cope with that and how I will deal with that. James?
What can I say? It happened pretty quick. I went in, it was mentioned. I think within a week they said you're in a trial. I thought, cool. Didn't have time to think about anything because there was more important issues at that time. Like you say, when someone says you got cancer, you fall apart a bit. The trials, from what I read, is the way to go. Yeah. I assume it works.
So, James, you did your own little bit of your own reading just to make sure you're making the right decision to deal with that uncertainty?
I read a little bit.
Yeah.
But, there's only so much you can read that either spins you out a little,
Yeah.
can send you down the wrong path too, and say, well, I'll make the most of what I've got. But with the trial, it gave me more.
Great. Now,
Still going.
Mark or Anne to make comment as well.
Look, it's about being honest with the patient and setting the bar at the right height. So, the way I explain clinical trials is what I've done today. It's about opportunity, it's about hope and optimism, it's realism. I tell them it might not work. I think one of the attractions of us doing phase 1 is actually it's appealing to patients. So, on the one hand, you get one hormone versus another, in a big phase 3 or phase 4. That's great that you go on a trial. It's not that exciting, but it's done a great job for you. But if you're a brain cancer patient and there are no options, or have another operation, or you have a drug which has got almost 0% chance of helping, and we're talking about a drug which, the one we've got, I think is unbelievable science. And I say that. I always say it looks good in the test tube and in mice, but, this might not work, and most of them don't. So it's about being honest and realistic. And actually, interestingly, I don't say take a week. I say don't agonise over it, tell us tomorrow. Because I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, and it either feels right or it doesn't feel right. And it's very uncommon for patients to say no. I think that's the right decision. I mean, who would know whether it's the right thing to do or not? I'm always surprised when patients tell me that they're going on a trial in Norway because they've looked at the 200 trials in brain cancer that are running around the world, and they've chosen the one in Norway. Well, I wouldn't know how to choose which one. So I think it's just being honest and straight up.
Okay, so
Do you want me to
some
just...
more questions up the back, and then Alison. Oh, Anne, you've got a comment.
I was
Sorry.
just going to say
Yeah.
as well, before a clinical trial can open, it has to go through a full ethical review process. So there's a very rigorous process that a trial has to go through before it can be opened. And then once a patient is on a clinical trial, they are supported by the research team, and so they're able. Consent isn't just signing a piece of paper and that's the end of it. We do encourage patients to keep coming back and asking questions and touching base with the research team and checking in the whole way through if they've got any questions along the way.
And we don't think about a trial unless we're sort of 90% sure that it's the right patient. So we're not going in completely cold. We've thought pretty carefully about it, and we know who would be almost certainly a suitable candidate.
I had a question about funding. One of the common themes has been the advantage of a clinical trial is that patients can access very expensive medication that they might not be able to access otherwise. And I'm just interested where you're seeing sources of funding come, particularly for the investigator-initiated trials, where that funding is coming from.
Yeah, so we distinguish, in the trials unit, we've got 154 trials running at the moment. 60% are what we call sponsored, so that almost certainly means Pfizer are paying for the whole trial. Every blood test, every scan, every nurse time, it's all paid for. And then the other 40% are non-sponsored, so sometimes there's money, sometimes there's not. They're investigator-initiated, and the two balance each other out. So the trial unit here and other trial units try and break even. We're not for profit, so we're not trying to make money. We try and reinvest any surplus. And the 60-40 seems to work pretty well. Sometimes it goes up to 70-30, so we've got to be careful. There are grants, so someone might have a great idea for a trial and they go to the NHMRC or some other funding body, and that provides some funding, not most of it, but some funding. State government gives $20 million to try and improve clinical trials, and we're going to spend $8.2 million on the investigator-initiated program. So, if a physio at Western's got a great idea, or a radiation oncologist at the Austin's got a great idea, and didn't have the wherewithal or the finances to take that trial ahead, then the program from the state government is going to assist.
Okay, and next up the back there, and I've seen two of you in the middle there, and also the front. So we've got plenty of questions. So, yep.
This question, I'm from the University of Melbourne, and we're obviously involved in clinical trials. This is a question about the risk, really, and liability profile attached to clinical trials. They're obviously extremely valuable for the progress of science and all of that. But then how do you, as a business or from that point of view, address the risk and also the medical liability that could attach if something goes wrong? Or
You mean the safety risk? And
safety risk.
So the financial risk is significant for a trials unit. It's a hard business. The safety risk, I think, is terribly overblown. There've been a couple of dreadful examples from years ago where a whole lot of patients got sick and died. a hand on my heart, I can't think of a moment like that where, these are cancer patients who most of the time have got metastatic cancer, it's spread, and it's not curable. These are the experimental drugs. So it's, the option of trying something experimental, you've got to weigh up potential benefit with the potential risk. Look, we are so careful about safety, and that's part of the sort of care and attention to detail and protocol, and someone notices that the blood test is slightly abnormal, whereas, I might not see it. Someone's noticed and something's done about it. So there's great care and attention to detail that makes all the difference. So the stories, there's been 2 disasters, one in Britain, and that was sort of poor management more than anything else.
Yeah, I might add to Mark that to my knowledge there has been not one legal case in Australia that has found, an Australian institution liable for a bad outcome in clinical trials. So it's sort of 0 out of, what was the number? 10,000 patients in how long? About 10 years? Yeah, so it's 0. The other thing was very interesting a number of years ago, clinical trials were starting to get harder to do. And part of the reason was each individual hospital went off and spoke to their own each individual insurers, and that was getting really inefficient. And so the Victorian Medical Insurance Agency took over insurance for all clinical trials in Victoria, and then that became a complete non-issue. It was fantastic actually to see, for Madeline, the sort of work that you do in, making sure the process behind the scenes makes clinical trials work well. So yeah, there's been some really good initiatives there to reduce any real liability and issues that for the clinical trial system and for the patients, importantly. So the Victorian Medical Insurance Agency do get input into all the consent forms to make sure everything's there, and the system actually, that side of the system works really efficiently now. Now I think Alison.
Yes, hello.
Yeah.
My question is directed to Mark. Yes, I know, I'm putting you on the spot. And it is, you said, look, if you want to, the best thing you can do about finding a clinical trial is just ask your doctor. Well, I actually don't think it's as easy as that, because the tumour stream that I'm involved with is melanoma. They are mostly diagnosed by your GP. So what do patients do? They come home from the GP and they look up Google, and invariably they'll find, some good sources, some bad sources, but often they'll come across a support agency, and if they go into those, they will find information about clinical trials, and that's good, that's great. So another pathway would be for the doctors, for the GPs, for you guys in the metropolitan areas to speak to your colleagues in rural and regional and the GPs and encourage their patients to go and look at these support and advocacy organisations on the internet. I'm just thinking of going in on another level, because
I completely agree, and I'll say a few words about the VCCC program, but it depends on which stream. So I look after brain cancer. A lot of regional patients come in for their neurosurgery. Actually, I'm gracious enough to say the medical oncologists and the radiation oncologists in Bendigo, Ballarat, Shepparton, Border, Traralgon, Warrnambool are just as good as me. And the only thing they can't do usually is do clinical trials. They don't have the trials in brain cancer. So they know they can phone me. They know they've got my contact number, and they do. They get in touch at the time they need to get in touch. And I hand over the care of the patient, but not completely. And I say the only thing I can do that they can't do in Warrnambool is I've got clinical trials. The moment you need to be thought of for thinking about a clinical trial is the moment the email can come to me or a phone call. So that connection's very close for brain cancer. For breast cancer, which is clearly huge, it has to be some other strategies, and Anne might want to talk to that.
Yes, so we have embarked. The Cancer Council in Victoria have a fantastic website which each public hospital inputs their clinical trials information into. And so we're working with the Cancer Council. We have a program at the moment about increasing awareness and just taking a moment to make sure that the information is current and meets the needs both of the clinicians and the patients, because we think it's really invaluable that you are able to go to a reputable source and get current and up-to-date information. And the Cancer Council has that information there.
It's actually on the advisory panel for
Fantastic.
that have been set up.
Yeah.
But I still think that there are a lot of patients out there before they even get to a tertiary hospital do not know about clinical trials.
Look, completely, yeah. And patient.
Worried about.
Well, I think we're working really hard through the strategy that we're talking about. And, you know, there's a big difference between the patient that I've sent back to an oncologist with a brain cancer in Ballarat, who rings me at the drop of a hat for advice, and to the 75-year-old non-English speaking breast cancer patient in Altona, who maybe doesn't have that sort of network of clinicians. So what do we call the network? Connections? No. Anyway, practice.
Okay, and I think there's gentleman, two up from Alison was next, and then one further question after that gentleman.
Hung said that one role of clinical trials was to give access to drugs which are in use overseas. Why does the TGA or the PBS reject the trial information from Europe or America? And if so, why?
So Avastin, that Avastin story, and Peter Ward, the photographer, is the classic version. So that drug it was TGA approved, so I could prescribe it. You had to pay $3,500 a month, because the PBAC that sits there and adjudicates on whether a drug is truly worthwhile to provide essentially free for Australians, they said no. So I think that was a fair decision. It's hard to justify in a health budget spending $3,500 a month, month after month after month, on 1,000 patients, when the data which we proved it's not a particularly effective drug. So someone like Peter Ward and many other patients got that drug. There are 120 of them who got it. Many of them benefited, but not enough for the PBAC to say, you know what, this drug's so good, we're going to put it on the PBS. Whereas the venetoclax, that'll make a move very quickly. So the venetoclax story, patients got venetoclax, probably the first patient in the world got it at Royal Melbourne or Peter Mac. So lots and lots and lots of Australian patients got that drug before it was ever TGA approved or going on the PBAC. So it can work in reverse.
And can I just follow up with that question to ask Julie to respond as well, actually? So, Julie, the drug you received, so palbociclib, is not reimbursed on the PBS. You made that point. Tell us what you feel about that. You've contributed to this knowledge about this drug and its benefits, and yet Australian women with breast cancer don't have access. How does that make you feel as a research participant?
It's actually quite frustrating because when you do read the research, that it is approved in the US, it is approved in the UK, it is approved in Europe, and so automatically we think, well, what are we doing? Why are we behind? And why is it taking us so long to catch up to be able to produce this drug that is available anywhere else, and to have patients who, there's a patient that I heard of who actually travels to Hong Kong every month to access the drug because that's the only way she can do it. And fortunately, her husband is on the health scheme over there that she can get it in that way. But that then goes down to very personal circumstances if you're able to afford to do things like that. So to know that that a drug that has been proven to help and assist in this way, and I take Mark's point that just because the US says it's okay, I worked in the US for 6 years, just because they said it's okay doesn't necessarily mean that we will follow. But I think the frustrating part that I'm finding at the moment, and I did read the whole response and why palbociclib was rejected in its initial application, but I'm finding it very frustrating now that the other drug, ribociclib, which does the same thing, is going to be, my understanding is it's going to be approved in the latest budget, but palbociclib isn't. And so there again, that's that inequality that I guess we have to work through and good part of.
So we might wind up, and I think just in winding up, want to lead on from Julie's point in that excellent last question, and that is that, you know, one can participate in different types of research. If one has cancer, it's not just a clinical trial of a new drug treatment. There is actually research underway around understanding the cost effectiveness of drugs, which is getting to the heart of, you know, why we should make the drugs available. And you know, Alison, who asked a question before, is involved in a project, Melbourne Melanoma Project, where now heading towards 3,000 patients have enrolled. And over the last 4 years, every one of those patients that's enrolled have given consent for access to their health economic data to actually understand the cost effectiveness of all these medical interventions. So those patients are involved in a clinical research study, contributing to our understanding about the cost effectiveness of healthcare to make these things more available. So just maybe the last word, if I may, from James. So I just want to touch on this. You know, we've talked a lot about new drugs and breakthrough drugs. And James, you've had a great outcome. You don't actually know whether you got the new thing or not, which is interesting. One thing I picked up on, you said to us that you got pins and needles. So we haven't touched on it, but if someone came to you and said, you know, we've got a trial of a new treatment to see whether we can make your pins and needles better or worse. So it's not trying to get rid of the cancer, it's actually trying to reduce the side effects. Is that something you'd be interested in? So reducing side effects of treatment?
Probably not really. It was minuscule.
Right.
Like if you got carpal tunnel syndrome, it's the same effect. Being an electrician, put up with that a lot. That's what I thought it was originally, but it turns out it was a side effect.
And what if, because it was fairly mild for you, but for some patients that pins and needles can be quite severe?
Yeah.
Yep.
So sorry.
It's individual, isn't it?
Yep.
For me, wasn't a problem. I could deal with it. For some people, it might have been a serious problem.
Yep. And Mark, you might make a comment about this as well, and particularly eligibility and how you choose people that may
I
or
was just
may
going
not
to say,
be suitable for
I reckon
certain
there's
trials.
been probably 5 or 6 moments in my career where I've gone, wow. And one of them was supportive care, where we would have to give huge doses of sedatives to guys having chemotherapy for their testis cancer and other cancers. We'd have to render them almost unconscious so they tolerate it and don't vomit. We're talking, you know, our time as registrars in the 80s and 90s. And then I remember seeing a photo, Henry Eckert, who was the professor of oncology at the Children's Hospital, showed a photo of 2 boys in beds next to each other. One had received a placebo, no drug. The other had received a new drug called ondansetron, which many cancer patients have now have. The first boy was unconscious because trying to stop him being sick, and the second boy was sitting up eating a McDonald's hamburger. You know, that's a wow moment. Now that is, you know, that's probably 5 or 6 in my lifetime. So, in fact, the GCSF, that old photo, that's a supportive care. That's not an anti-cancer treatment. It's a supportive care. So, you know, we don't just think about chemotherapies or drugs that make cancer smaller. We try and make patients better and their quality of life better.
Yep. And James, did you have much vomiting during your chemo?
None whatsoever.
There you go. So that was due to that class of drugs, which some of my colleagues, Mark, have described the biggest breakthrough in their career in cancer treatments is that supportive care method.
Well, I remember the photo from 20 years ago.
Yep. All right, so on that note, I just want to thank everyone for their attention. I'm going to give you some little take-homes from each of our speakers tonight. So I think we heard from Hung in detail about the process of clinical trials, which is rigorous and can give everyone confidence about the uncertainty question that we heard about earlier. James gave us that powerful message about altruism and the willing to help other people. James, fantastic for you to be on a trial. To this day, don't even know whether you got the real treatment. That's just fantastic altruism and contribution to fellow humankind. So thank you. Julie, one of the things I took home from your remarkable story is how your oncologist had to ring every hospital in Australia. So we need better systems for allowing people to find clinical trials. Wow. So what a powerful message. And Mark's message is simple, it's personal. It's personal. It's about patients. It's about their carers. It's about the people that care for them. It's all very, very important. And the clinical trials is how we make progress in a personal way for patients. So, thank you everyone for your attention, and thank you very much to our panellists and speakers who've done an absolutely wonderful job. Thanks so much.